Hey, good evening, everybody. Good morning, depending on your time zone, where you are, where you're from. James and James, can you hear me okay?
Yes.
Yes, fine,
Great.
David.
Okay, so just before we get started, I would just like to apologize to everybody. As you know, we had technical difficulties last week, and unfortunately, the webinar was unable to be started. We didn't have the correct permissions and passwords or whatever to get in. We do apologize. Nothing we could do about it, and we want to thank you for your patience and coming again to back to us today. So today we have James Crowter and James Pearson from Clever Dynamics, and they are going to be telling us about a process of getting everybody onto the cloud. So now, before we get started, I'd like everybody just to make sure your mic is muted. We will take questions. If you have a question, there is a question window. Type the question in there. I will pick them up. If it's anything technical, didn't hear anything, I'll help you. If it's a question regarding the actual presentation, at 15 minutes before the end of the hour, we will address those questions, have a small Q&A so that everybody will have a chance to get your questions answered. Please write them in. It will really, really help me if you could put the questions in as soon as possible. Please don't leave them till the very end. If you could, thank you very much. As you know, the Areopa webinars are published on YouTube and stored on our website. The screen is here. You will see a recording at a later stage. Also, make sure to sign up to the newsletter. You'll get the emails letting you know things like the cancellation we have or the changed and the new issues coming up. We will publish a list of all our new ones, and these are the ones we have coming now. So if you want to, you'll be able to see these at a later stage. We do have a regular process of upcoming webinars. Okay, so if you would like to, the process, it's a little bit daunting if you've never done it before, but it is a great chance to get your name out there. It's a great chance to actually fine-tune your skills. So we're always looking for new speakers. So if you're interested, please get in touch with us and let us know. So we are very thankful to our sponsor, 4Nav, who make this possible. They are the sponsors for these events, and thank you very much to them. I'm now going to hand over to James and James. It's all yours.
Okay, thank you very much, David. This is James Pearson, and I'm going to hand you over to James Crowter just to introduce who we are and what we're going to be talking about today.
Good afternoon. James Crowter. I think about the tallest person in our community. So some of you have seen me around at Directions and places like that. So MVP for a while. And also have the privilege of being the CEO of two companies now in the UK. One is a company called Technology Management, which is a long-time partner. And recently that split out to form an ISV called Clever Dynamics. So that's where that comes from. So we've got an agenda today. We were asked by Luke to share some of our experiences. I think we're 3 or 4 years down the road of developing first V1 extensions, now V2, really getting ready for SaaS. AppSource has been a part of our life for probably 3 years now since it first launched. We've had the challenges of getting there, things like licensing, and really share some of the things we've learned. So that's our agenda for today. So really moving on, Clever Dynamics, it's the product division of technology management. We're a long time VAR of First Navision and all the way through all the different name changes now to Business Central. Here in the UK, we have, I don't know how many customers exactly, but it's in excess of 300 these days. And most of our customers are around the warehouse management and manufacturing piece. So lots of distribution companies, lots of manufacturing companies. So that's where we specialize. And we found we were repeating lots of those solutions multiple times. So about 4 or 5 years ago now, we really saw 2015, 2016. As an MVP, I got an early heads up around what was coming with events. And we felt we should then start to refactor all of the solutions we've built so that we could make them more discreet, more easy to implement, more unique in that respect, it's repeatable. And so we set up the Clever Dynamics, and James Pearson took the role of product manager, so leading that development team and designing them through. And we've ridden the wave ever since, and it's had a few ups and downs, as waves do. Some of the things have been great, some of the things not so great, but we'll share some of those as we go through. First thing we hit was Apps V1 in 2017, and it's the ability to deploy apps in a very discrete way. Gave us a whole set of ideas about breaking our solution down into lots of discrete extensions, rather than having one big, perhaps traditional monolithic set of objects as you tended to do in the CAL days. That made it much more flexible in terms of potential customers, and also vertical markets. Vertical markets for me aren't really, it's more a marketing concept than a technical concept, in terms of that you have companies in the same vertical that tend to have very different requirements. And that meant that trying to build every possible permutation of requirement into one set of objects was difficult. You ended up with lots of setup screens, lots of parameters to turn things on and off, that wasn't always intuitive to the customer. Whereas if we broke them down into discrete apps, you could either install them or not install them, depending on whether you needed that particular functionality or not. The challenge, obviously, is how they work together. We'll cover that a little bit later on around some of our techniques for doing that and challenges that we faced. But really, we took the focus that the smaller we could make them, the more modular, if you like, we could make them, the better. But with a focus, obviously, on what that customer wanted to do. So that's resulted in quite a number of apps. You'll see on the design diagram the app structure. This is just as it is at the moment. It's growing. I think probably for James, it's growing a little bit too fast as we come up with more and more suggestions. I think like most ISVs, we're almost struggling to keep up with the demand for ever improving functionality, and whether we build them into an existing app or whether we break them down even further is a constant discussion that we're tending to have about where we go forwards. Certainly, it's made it challenging. We've also had ones which are not core to what we do, and we've had question marks of, once you put something in AppSource, you very much are committed to it. Once you have customers on it, really your opportunity to back out is not there. So even if it's that's a commercial decision you have to think through very carefully. It's probably more a commercial decision than a technical decision for me about what goes in and what doesn't. Per tenant apps are still a very valid option. Sharing those becomes more difficult, so though with the renumbering becoming easier, you can redeploy. You have got an element of reusability in there that's easier than you had in the CAL days. But still, if you're looking to market it, and certainly if you're going the ISV route, it needs to be an AppSource. I have a love-hate relationship with AppSource. I think that it's very much could be a lot better, and I know Microsoft have a lot of aspiration to make it better. So don't take what it is today as what it will be. I think the searching, the SEO with AppSource is going to improve. One quick little story: I was in Seattle recently talking to the AppSource team and asked why some of the promised improvements for AppSource hadn't been delivered. And I got told the story. A lot of you will have heard about the $10 billion contracts that Microsoft won from the US Department of Defense, the so-called JEDI contract. Well, what wasn't perhaps widely known is as part of that, there was a marketplace for applications that was part of that contract requirement. Microsoft didn't have one obvious that they could just provide. So they eventually said that the technology behind AppSource would fulfill that requirement. They obviously won that contract. So actually for the last 6 months, all of the AppSource development team have been working on the JEDI contract for the US Department of Defense to make it do the rest of what it needs to do. Hence, we're having to wait a little bit longer than perhaps we should have done. But I think once they've hopefully finished dealing with that, then they'll come back and we'll start to see vast improvements. Okay. So what it does do is give great visibility. We get more inquiries because of AppSource now than the other source of leads, which was we put a lot of videos for our software onto YouTube, initially for our for TechMan's clients to watch, and then we started getting inquiries externally as well. AppSource now, people are finding it, people are reading the descriptions unbelievably carefully, and then popping up to ask a whole bunch more questions. So it certainly has, it's not a situation where they'll just click and install. They generally want to know all of the detail that you can provide, but it's certainly got us customers and partners in countries that we wouldn't have dreamt of going to before. As I said before, you do have to be aware of the maintenance aspect of this. You know, the 15 update, I think most of you will be aware, there was quite a lot of refactoring to do, getting that all done and getting it into AppSource on time for the updates rolling through took some serious effort. And so, you know, there's no guarantee that won't happen again, even if Microsoft's intention is to make less breaking changes. It's something you should be aware of. So you really have to consider the potential market before you put it into AppSource. Just how many of these, how many subscriptions are you looking for before you get to a situation where this really is going to not just pay for itself, but make money for you. It's the overhead of AppSource needs to be factored into your business plan for this. It's fair to say, you know, the game has changed, is the heading on the slide. The update cycles, you can't guarantee that you're going to have customers for a considerable period of time anymore. You know, we've already had some customers who've used apps, subscribed, and then dropped the subscription for whatever reason. It really makes sense when you've got to, instead of having lots of apps, you've got to be the best at the particular area that you target. You look at all of the app stores out there, be it iOS or the Google Play Store. You know, the #2 app has just a fraction of the installs that the #1 app has. So I think we are in a little of an arms race right now where, you know, everybody is desperately trying to establish themselves as the #1 app for that particular functionality, the go-to solution. And I think that will keep happening. So be cautious about quite how many different areas you choose to go to. You would be better being the winner in one than the second app in 5. The rate of change from Microsoft is getting ever faster, and the support cycles. So, you know, you've got to keep checking your DevOps process has got to be spot on, and that's something we've invested a lot of time and effort in getting right, to get, as soon as Microsoft check in something that will break our app, really we need to check against that and understand, not necessarily do the work, but understand how much work is involved before really we're facing a very short space. I think we all have a challenge of skills, the amount of time we've got, the range of skills we've got is getting wider and wider, and keeping up across that whole piece is getting a bigger challenge. So we're seeing more and more specialization where some people are focusing almost exclusively on DevOps. Some people are focusing on writing code. There's much more of a support and maintenance function within the organizations as well. And so how are you going to organize for that? Who is going to lead each one of those aspects for you? Is something you need to take in mind. And per tenant apps as well. You know, that's we've now got in Techman, we've got tenants with 90 plus extensions. Now that's extreme, but when you start putting different document layouts into a different extension, because it means that you can version control them much easier when you do that, it starts to really mount up. Again, we've got customers that are now into double figures with the number of ISV partners that they have installed in their one tenant. And I really think this is the future where, you know, clients are now coming to us on a regular basis and saying, we found this, what do you think of it? And we're having to keep up with that. So understanding that whole kind of permutation is quite difficult. When you get to app source presentation, you know, as I've already outlined, we chose to break down into lots of small apps. And from a technical perspective, I think that makes the management of them, the update of them much easier, especially when you get into kind of country restrictions. We have some of our solutions which are only really applicable in the UK because of UK commercial practice. We have others that have very much a worldwide appeal, we hope. So how do we mix that up? How would we mix that up in just one app? But then you've got the marketing section where, you know, if a potential customer is going to outsource and looking for a particular vertical, and you've got 14, 18 apps that make up that vertical, how do they find you? How do they understand what your offer is? So that's really where the consulting offers in AppSource do make sense, because you can offer a consulting offer which is very much for that particular type of customer, that target customer, and you can leave the apps side of AppSource as very much, we address this functionality deficit in the core application. Dependent only apps if needed. So on the big chart, you'll have seen Clever Config, which is that kind of library app. We use that for things like licensing, things like inter-app dependencies, so that one app will make use of another app only if that app is installed. There's not a hard dependency on that. We can communicate using events through that Clever Config app, so that always gets installed, but is never seen in AppSource and is never really understood by the client. It just gets popped in by default. Okay. So, hot topic. Some of you maybe have seen some of the challenges. I posted a blog on LinkedIn not so long ago about some of the performance challenges we're having when we're getting more and more ISVs, more and more specifically table extensions. You know, whichever way you look at it, and whoever you think is to blame for those performance issues, and each ISV, you know, their solution works just fine when they're the only one installed, but when you put them cumulatively together, which is how the client wants to use them, the performance does go down. And whether you think this is a Microsoft issue, that they should have not designed it so that there were quite so many joins, or not, whichever, the client doesn't really care or understand that. So you really need to have performance in mind right from day one of your design, I believe. And it's something we're increasingly having to bear in mind and look at. Things like, you know, the API throttling, which Microsoft are going to introduce, are also going to make it much more performance to be much more of an issue for Connect apps as well. And clients don't understand which fields have indexes on. They just want to use it. And it's our job to really make sure that they can use it in a way that works for them, I believe. So you really need to test against or think about large database tables with hundreds of thousands of records. That's the real world. Cronus actually isn't the real world. And I wish that they would really uprate what is in Cronus. I think that's really a legacy size these days. We've had calls. I've had the pleasure of having calls from the platform team saying that we're responsible for a noisy neighbor. It's not pleasant. It's a bit of a shock. You really have to then jump on. The telemetry is starting to help, but I use the word starting deliberately because I don't think it's completely there yet. So it can actually on SaaS be quite hard compared to the lovely tool set we've had on Azure SQL in the last few years to look at long-running queries, etc., and really understand where they're coming from and be able to go and design them out. You can't kill sessions. There's hints that that's coming. So in effect, once something started, once somebody commits a process, it has to finish. You have no way of killing that off and restoring performance. So that certainly causes some challenges where you just have to say to the client, you got to wait, and we're not sure how long exactly it's going to be, but it will finish eventually. Is not really a kind of conversation that goes down well with them on occasion. So be aware of what you're doing and be aware of when you've got a couple of million records in that table, how that's exactly going to work.
Okay, thanks.
So over to James.
Yeah. Thank you. Yeah. So let's talk about this awful word, SaaSification, which I first heard in a Microsoft context, thinking about getting ISVs ready for the cloud. And by that, they mean you've got something of a perfect storm in that you've got users who possibly don't know a great deal about your app. They don't know how it works. You have to assume they haven't read your carefully crafted documentation, or they haven't watched your videos. It's likely we are finding that they haven't involved their partner yet either. Perhaps they're not even familiar with Business Central because they're trialing Business Central itself and are trialing your app as part of their trial of the whole platform. So you've got users who are very underprepared compared to what we're used to for using our apps. In the past, it was a fair assumption that they will be familiar with how Nav works. They will have a consultant who is on site to train them and to guide them through their first use. So bearing that in mind, how can you guide users through the setup and the use of your app? How do you highlight the key functionality that you really want them to see before they make a decision about your app? Because our assumption is that when people install from AppSource, they are in an evaluation mode. And perhaps you'll know yourself when you trial apps on your phone, which is the closest analogy we've got, I think. How long will you struggle trying to set up and use an app before you uninstall it again and go and try another one from the store if you're not making any progress with it? So you have a very limited window to make a favorable impression on these new users. So we try and address that through having as much default configuration as possible. We like our apps to have plenty of setup options so that the app is flexible and will work in different scenarios. Thinking about our warehousing app, you can use inventory documents or warehouse documents. You might use directed put away and pick or not. And we want to support all of those scenarios, but we don't want to force the user to do a lot of setup before they can even evaluate the app. So we have a service that provides rapid start configuration packages, which we can separate per country or per version of Business Central or per version of the app. So as we add new features to the app, we might change the default configuration that you receive for that version. We provide notifications, saying thank you for installing our app. Here is a clickable link to go to some key page in the app or some key setup that must be completed before you can actually use the app. And then assisted setups obviously help with that, having a wizard that guides users through. Because we want to get from installation to actually being in a situation where we're getting some value out of the use of this app as quickly as possible, to maximize the likelihood that we'll then get the customer contacting us and saying, actually, I'd quite like to continue using this app. And often that's the point at which the reseller becomes involved. The end users have gone through that whole process before we're even aware of who their reseller is. So that's some practical things to consider when we're trying to make our apps SaaS ready. James, protecting our IP.
Yeah, and I think this, this has been a hot topic of discussion, I think, within our community over the last probably couple of years now. Traditionally, probably we didn't have as much opportunity to do this. You had CFMD and a few ways, but the core code was in there. And that from a customer support with my VAR hat on, that from a customer support was great. I've contacted ISVs and told them about a bug in their code because I've been able to trace through and see exactly what's happening and that it's not expected behavior. And so we've taken the view that we will continue to show code in most of our apps. The exception is the core app, the library app, which has our licensing functionality in it. Clearly, you want to protect that a little bit more, but it's also a belief that we're, it's the design and expertise behind the app rather than just the code itself that actually is a value rather than. And therefore, if somebody does take the trouble to go and rip that code off, then chances are they're not going to provide a very good experience for the end user than we would do with all of the surround stuff that we provide in terms of documentation, yada, yada, yada. And therefore, I think we need to be confident enough to say, that we will take the traditional approach that Navision has always had of allowing people to participate, allowing people to read it, allowing people to understand it, rather than just trying to hold it tight. And the key thing I would say is, for every pirate you deter, how many customers are going to go, actually, this is harder to work with, this is less friendly, we're actually coming away from this. This is a black mark in its favor rather than a big tick. I think Microsoft could help here. What I've lobbied for in the past is that actually show my code should go to being an object property rather than an extension property, because I think that would allow us to hide a couple of key code units that perhaps had a key function in that did the real magic, and that would give a lot of comfort to a lot of ISVs. So I think that could be a real answer to this conundrum. But for the moment, we don't have that, and so I would urge everybody to take the trusting route rather than assume that everybody out there is a criminal enough to to rip off your code.
Okay, let's talk licensing, which I guess is a related conversation to protecting your IP. Because we are young as ISVs go, we hadn't got any licensing service that we were able to use for the new apps that we were making. And traditionally, of course, you've been able to secure your IP to some extent by limiting the resellers that you grant permission to your ISV object range to. That's not true on SaaS. Everyone runs on the same license, and that license has access to all of the object ranges, which provides something of a challenge. We had been hoping that Microsoft would solve this problem, that through the AppSource marketplace or through CSP, they would give us the ability to sell seats on our licenses and restrict our functionality depending on whether a particular tenant was licensed or not. And of course, that it's still our hope that eventually Microsoft will belatedly solve that challenge. But we got to the summer of last year, we'd got our tickets for Vienna booked to be a sponsor at Directions, and we thought we just cannot go to Directions and show off our apps without having a sensible answer to the question of, so how do we actually purchase and license these apps? So we had to put together some solution of our own, and a few design goals we came up with from the start. We've talked about users trialing our apps from AppSource. That has become a valuable source of information about prospective customers to us. When you submit an offer to AppSource, you also submit the CRM system or Salesforce or Azure table or whatever you want, where the lead information will be published to. So whenever someone installs an app from AppSource, we get a lead generated in our CRM system. So a definite design goal was we must not make it any harder to trial apps from AppSource. Clearly, as much as we're talking about SaaS, on-prem is still at least as important, if not more important, market for us at the moment. So any solution we come up with should work on-prem as well as on SaaS. However, when you open the solution up to running on someone's own infrastructure and they've got SQL access to the BC database, it becomes very much harder to secure your licensing model. And so we took a pragmatic approach to it should be difficult to circumvent our licensing system, but we are not going to invest lots of time trying to prevent unscrupulous partners from doing so on-prem. It doesn't seem like a sensible investment to us. So James has said that it's the only app where we don't show our code. That's the code that calls our licensing service. And we have an app in our BC backend system that generates license details. So when you install an app from AppSource, we look at your combination of Azure Tenant ID and your license ID. The combination of those two will uniquely identify you, regardless of whether you're on-prem or on SaaS. And we will generate a license line. We'll set an expiry date for that trial X number of days into the future. And as a good byproduct of doing that, we're also collecting some useful insights about the versions of Business Central that people are installing from, the countries they're installing from. We're able to collect a little bit of data about the tenant, which we can marry with the leads that we get generated into CRM, and that helps us to reach out to these customers and involve their partners and complete the deal. Microsoft will at some point add monetization via CSP. I don't know if James can tell you a timescale particularly, but for the time being, we are still investing in our own licensing solution, and we know that other organizations are doing the same, QBS, for instance. So that's a bit about the licensing challenge. The last slide from me, then I'll hand you back over to James. Just a few miscellaneous quick tips, some experiences that we've had working with SaaS and with AppSource. In general, we're expecting it to take at least a week between submitting an updated offer on AppSource to it going through the certification and being live in the store. Hot fixes can be rushed through, but obviously you don't want to make a habit of that and call on too many favors from the certification team. Having said that, and I must be fair, I had an app that I submitted earlier this week which did pass and was live in AppSource later the same day, which is the first time that's happened, but so that was great. But in general, we're expecting at least a week turnaround. And given that, you want to minimize the number of times you are forced to make an update to your app. Reduce the number of things that would require a change to the app itself. So we talked about configuration. If you need to change the default behavior of the app, can you do that through a configuration package rather than through making a code change to the app itself and having to submit an update? Can you make use of Azure Functions as a proxy for communicating with third-party APIs? That way, if the API changes, you have to change some API keys or whatever it is, can you avoid needing to make a change to your Business Central app? Can you handle that in the Azure function, which of course you have far more control over how and when you deploy that. We develop against Docker containers. Each developer has a Surface Book 2, which is capable of running at least 2 containers simultaneously. We found that it's just a more reliable solution than developing against a shared container on some shared hardware. Having said that, we do also test against demo SaaS environments that we create from demos.microsoft.com. We develop against sandbox images. That's the closest you can get to a SaaS environment other than a demo tenant itself. But just be aware that there are some differences between a sandbox and an on-prem image. It's useful to be able to test against on-prem because it has better demo data, but it does behave slightly differently to a sandbox image. So just be aware of that. And it's still useful to test against an actual SaaS tenant, not just against a Docker container, because then you're running on the actual SaaS license, on the actual SaaS hardware, albeit when you create a demo tenant, the hardware that runs on will not perform as well as a production tenant. So we also install our apps into production environments once the app has gone live and do some final checks when it's actually gone live in AppSource as well. James has talked about DevOps. We are always running pipelines in Azure DevOps. We want to be able to verify that our app runs against the current build of Business Central, so 15.3 as of today. We want it to run against VC14 and even 13 in some cases for our on-premise customers. We want to test it against the upcoming 15 build and the upcoming 16 build. So in some cases, that's at least 5 different versions that we're testing our apps against. That's before you throw in different localizations into the mix. So just be clear that last point about which versions, which languages and countries you want to support, because once it's on AppSource, you're making that commitment that you will keep this app current for your SaaS customers. They are going to get upgraded, and if they can't be upgraded because your app is preventing that, they will get an email saying that your app is the thing to blame, and no one wants an email like that. Think about your on-premise customers as well. If you go beyond the 14, of course, that's the last version with cal objects. So that's where we're seeing quite a few projects are sticking for the time being. If you're developing for SaaS, that's great. Do you also want to develop for on-premise, in which case you need to be looking at least as far back as version 14 or 13. So that's a few quick tips, a few things we've picked up along the way. I'll hand you back to James, and we're going to quickly go through some of our experiences from the VAR perspective on SaaS.
James. So the VAR perspective on SaaS is that it feels like you've been relieved of control. You know, where we used to be able to really control what a client did. They had, you know, installing an ISV solution really took at least a day of dev time. Now they can stick that in very quickly themselves and then ring you up and say, this is what I've done. And the problem is, it's your biggest, most proactive customers that tend to be the ones that go out and find that stuff, right? So, and by definition, they're probably the ones that spend the most with you. So therefore, they cause you the biggest headache if you really disillusion them by keep saying no. And so if you've not got a better alternative that you can point them in the direction of straight away, you know, you probably got to say, okay, give us a short period of time to look at this app source solution, and we'll come back to you and tell you what you think. That's meant that as a VAR, we're, you know, I'm sure Clever Dynamics is new to a lot of people in the audience, but there's lots of other ISVs that are new to me that I've, having been in this community for 20 odd years, I'm learning, you know, about lots of them that customers are now bringing to the table. And so you've got to have a process really of evaluating whether you should recommend them or not. And that's really asking some questions about how they're structured, you know, whether they're likely to be around for the long term. If the ISV is, you know, dare I say, a one-man band, that's not to say it's prohibitive, but if that one person stops doing that app and it's business critical to your client, then that might cause some risk. On the other hand, if it's something that just makes the process a little bit quicker and a little bit easier, but there is a clear and easy workaround, what's to say don't use it? How are you going to support smooth, timely upgrades is a question. You know, when you've got literally hundreds of ISV solutions out there and thousands of per tenant apps, you know, that first test wave that we had of BC15 rolling out literally caused us to have over 450 emails from Microsoft saying this tenant extension has failed. Now, a lot of those were a 2-minute fix. A change to the language call in document layouts was my favorite because that fixed almost half of them straight away. But you've got to be able to manage it. You've got to keep up. And you've got to look after it for your client. That's what your client is expecting, I believe. You need to be on top of that. The automation and admin APIs have been really good for us. We've built some extensions to our internal Business Central system that go off and pick up that information so we can manage it, not just from a licensing perspective. We know what extensions are installed. We know what versions they're on. We know who else has the same app. And so how do we, how can we, in effect, make sure that we update all of them, and our support team can track that and understand when they find a bug where they need to push it to solve a problem before it's going. But responsibility comes back to you. It's a challenge for all VARs, and I think it's one that's only going to get bigger. Business Central is a volume play for me. You know, it looks like being several order of magnitudes bigger than NAV was. It's being used by different extremes. The medium-sized companies are bigger than ever, and the very small are smaller than ever because of the affordability.
James, can I interrupt a sec?
Sure.
Yeah, we've got 15 minutes to go. We've got a really good attendance, and it's actually growing, but we don't have any questions yet. So that means either you're very clear and everyone understands it, or they're just deers in the headlight right now. So anyone who's got any questions, now's the time to type them up, and I'll let you keep going. I'll interrupt again in 10 minutes.
No worries. So as I said, you can't control what's installed in each client anymore, even if you wanted to. You know, recently had the MD of one of our bigger clients on SaaS call me up and say, I found this, can we use it? And you really have to you know, be quite strong. If I say no, then potentially I'm setting a perception in his head that I'm unhelpful, blocking. I've got to at least come up with a better alternative. And so to do that, we need a formal evaluation process for apps that we're going through. Our first question is, what is the consequence if you're forced to uninstall? If 15.3 comes out and it doesn't support it, and for whatever reason you need to get that update, Microsoft, I think, have been quite good about not forcing upgrades where there's an app that doesn't work yet. We've still got a couple of tenants that are still on 14 because of one block or another with a third party. You know, I think they've been actually quite understanding in letting those slide this long past the terms and conditions, but sooner or later they're going to enforce that. So what's the impact on the client business if they have to uninstall? The ISV, you know, how long have they been around? How well do we know them? How well do we rate their capability, their technical skills, our ability to transact with them reliably, etc. What's their documentation like? Where's that? You know, how good is that? How up to date is it? Does it give us a change log? Do they have a docs site the way that Microsoft do? I think these are fairly things that you should expect as standard. When we're building dependencies on those third-party apps, quite often for us to use DevOps on our per tenant extensions, we'll need their extensions. So do they supply those extensions and hopefully automated tests that we can use as part of our DevOps process so that we can, in effect, make sure that we haven't broken anything on top of what they've supplied? Is that going to be a possibility? Because again, longer term, I think that that's probably the only way it's going to go. Support time zones certainly come into this. Buying apps out of the US, you know, you have different, only half the day where you can talk to that ISV, and so you have to wait till lunchtime before it's worth trying to make comment. Escrows are an interesting one that they're coming back to our community. You know, they were a mandatory part of CFMD. I don't know many people that ever use them, but we started to see Planner One, the Autumn's Planner One, Dassault Planner One, withdrawal from the market was a little bit of a lesson for us. If we have an ISV that unfortunately goes into administration, where will that leave our customer, and will escrows protect them against that? So from a VAR perspective, I think there's you need to get together and discuss the world. We've seen from an ISV with the Clever Dynamics hat on, we've seen some VARs react in that we can't support this, we don't know it, we don't want to be involved. We want nothing whatsoever to do with it. When their customers have gone to them saying, we want to use a Clever Dynamics app. And I know from conversation with those customers that hasn't actually pleased the customers at all. So I don't think that's a long-term option unless you can explain to that customer why you don't want to support that app, why it's not a good idea. You have to have a list of reasons. If you have a formal evaluation criteria, you have a chance of doing that. Otherwise, probably the boat is going to sail past you before you get to that. Specialize your people. Yeah, absolutely. So again, when you take AppSource and all the different apps that are available, the hero that you've had in the past who knew everything about everything just doesn't have a hope. I probably have aspired to be one of those in the past. These days, it's kind of like, what the hell, dude? That's an app I've never even heard of. So, you know, and what does it do? So I think you're going to have to specialize people into functional areas. They're going to know not just the core application, but the add-ons in that application. For me, you're seeing Microsoft more and more leave the functionality side to third parties. And so there's going to be, you know, Dynamics Business Central is not going to be the same for everybody once they put these apps on top of it. So you have to have somebody who absorbs that, keeps on top of a particular area, and then shares what they've learned with their colleagues quickly and easily, so that, and effectively, when you have a question, you have somewhere to go to look and share and find out without having to start up a new test instance, install it all, see what it does. Keeping on top of it, work at partnerships, decide the partnerships that are going to be most important to you, make sure the admin, the monetization, the licensing works well. Be aware of the implications, what's coming in the past. It's going to be, ISVs are going to be as important as Microsoft itself. If you take the view that Microsoft functionality hasn't really changed dramatically in the last, 5-10 years? You know, when was the last major new area introduced? It's some number of versions to now. They seem to be focusing a lot on the platform, but less on the functional side. So it's ISVs that have to fill that gap, and you're going to have to decide who you're working with and really stay on top of that in a way that you perhaps haven't in the past. So get ahead of it. It's, you know, the world has changed. I'm afraid reverting back to the nice, comfortable world of Dynamics Now, where you were completely in control over timescales, as well as what actually happened. I don't believe that's coming back. And therefore, you've got two options. You can either look at the new world, decide what the pros and cons are, try and work your way around those cons and manage them best you can, and you know, endeavor to be a good partner to your customer in this new world. Or you can stick your head in the sand and probably, you know, I've never known anybody who's done that, who's come out of it after a few years thinking that it was a good option. So adopt or die is another way of saying it. I think it's the world we're in today, and you know, the one thing that I am convinced are our customers, end users, are loving it. They're loving the speed to value. You know, they can go find an app, they can install it, compared to a 4-6 week cycle for you to spec and develop something at the very minimum. They just think that's gorgeous. They have a need, they find it, they deliver it. We have, I checked AppSource this morning, there's 660 BC apps in there today. That seems to be going up by 50 or 60 a month right now. And the chances are that they're not going to find what they want in AppSource, or at least something good enough, perhaps, you know, is going down all the time. So see where it goes. I don't think per tenant extensions are going to go away at all, but I expect them to be really small, really specific, things like interface development and so on, that perhaps is very specific to that particular tenant. The rest, I think, is going to go over the next 2, 3, 4 years, more and more the app source direction, more and more the repeatability direction, and therefore get ready for this. So I think, David, we've finished with 5 minutes to go. So I don't know if there are any questions yet. Can't see anything.
Absolutely perfect, Tom. The only question was one from Luke. He was just asking if the last slides were specific to VARs, but I'm quite sure they were. So
yes,
I'm not sure what his question was. Yeah. Okay. Yeah, there's no questions right at this point, except that I have a couple of questions. So while I'm waiting for everybody else to ask some questions, I'll ask you too. One of them is not so much a question, but more of a comment, is that to me, the biggest concern's always been, I mean, extensions, verticals, whatever, there's not really an issue with the coding, which I think a lot of people panic about. It's everything else that's the big thing. But one of the biggest concerns I have is licensing. It's been from day one. There's never been a licensing tool. There's not been a way for me to write code, write an extension, get it on AppSource and get money. You know, I've got to handle all that myself. I mean, just personally, I think that should have been Microsoft's higher priority than, for instance, getting AL working, that sort of thing. I don't know if it's just me, but it seems like that's the biggest gap right now.
So there's been several attempts. There's been several pilots, and if you want to look at what's coming, go look at what's happened in the Azure marketplace and the Office marketplace. And actually, Dynamics now is the exception. Because in the Azure marketplace, I can go and buy an ISV solution. I pay Microsoft on a CSP SKU, and Microsoft gives the money, less a percentage, 20% as it happens, to the ISV. And that is the licensing model that actually Microsoft in the Azure marketplace is almost pushing. They're almost penalizing ISVs that don't go that route under the ISV Connect program. Now, the ISV Connect program has not come to Business Central yet. I've been in the room when those discussions have happened, and I agree with Microsoft that there are some changes. We're not transacting £1 million Azure platforms subscription. We're probably doing lots of small amounts with many more customers than they are doing on the Azure platform. So that will come, but recently they've introduced it to the Office marketplace. And one of the guys I know from Finland, a company called Picket, they have 3.5 million users that they expect to migrate to CSP over the next couple of years. So and they're paying $1.50 each a month. So clearly, if it works for Office, it should work for Dynamics. I'm 100% convinced it will come, David, but a date, I've had too many dates broken to promise anything to say another one now.
But it is coming. I mean, to me, it's pretty critical. So thanks for your opinions on that. I know you can't give facts, but I just want to hear from you. My other question is, since we've got a couple of minutes and there's no other questions yet except a comment from Luke, in terms of, we've seen this in the industry, in the whole market of Navision, everybody panicking about AL and programming and coding. And we know that it's a very, very small, minuscule percentage of the cost of maintaining an app. In terms of the smaller partners that have really geared themselves up for lots of on-site development, on FaceTime with customers, writing code on the spot and developing reports and adding tables, etc. Obviously, it's going to be a struggle for them to move to this. In terms of a small partner, what sort of headcount or what size of a company do you need to be? What's the smallest you can be to actually get out there and create an app, put it on App Store and sell it? And maintain it and write videos and training manuals and testing, etc.
So, I think that's really where my comments were. It depends how much of how much you bite off. And if you had one app that did something really simple but really extraordinarily useful, then I think you've got a chance as a one-man show. And I would recommend that to the customers. If it was something that, I know, save them 20 seconds of sales order putting on each sales order they put on, I'd recommend it, because save the 20 seconds. Look, guys, if we need to uninstall it, well, you're only back to square one. Okay, so it's not mission critical. It's not going to stop the business working if we have to take it out. It might cause pain, but it won't absolutely be unable to transact. Other apps where I want to do a lot more due diligence, or if this doesn't work, I can't ship anything. That for me would be a different level of magnitude.
Thanks. That's a very interesting perspective on it. Really appreciate it. So Lucas just commented with this fabulous presentation. I agree. These are the sorts of presentations that really mean something in the Areopa type community. So it helps a lot of people because you tackle an issue that people aren't talking about. So thank you to James and James. I will again thanks to 4Nav for sponsoring this. But guys, this really was a great presentation. For everybody listening, you will be able to get it go to our site Areopa and subscribe and have a look at the YouTubes and watch this again, because I think this was a great presentation. Thank you very, very much.
Just like to say, if anybody's got any follow-on questions or questions that they don't want to actually do in public, our email addresses are on the screen. Give us a shout and we'll do our level best to help.
Great. Thanks very much. I'm stopping the recording now. Thanks, everybody.
Thank you. Bye-bye.